Welcome to History Doc.
All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking way past those sensational headlines today to uncover the exact ecosystem of enablers that shielded Jeffrey Epstein for decades. For years, the public focus has really just been on the gossip and isolated criminal acts. But the massive document releases leading up to 2026 have given us an unprecedented look into the systemic rot that actually allowed all of this to happen. We're going to examine a comprehensive framework that breaks down the philosophy and the exact legal mechanisms used to build a literal fortress of impunity around one individual. So here's the million-dollar question, right? How exactly does a known predator operate in plain sight for literal decades? Well, we have to totally ditch this myth of the lone predator. Once we do that, we can start to see how an architecture of elite deviants was meticulously built. The recently unsealed files prove, without a doubt, that this was never just the work of one man. Instead, it required a highly coordinated service industry. We're talking about a massive ecosystem of pilots, bankers, lawyers, and prestigious institutions that either actively facilitated or just actively chose to ignore a global trafficking operation. To really grasp how this all happened, we're going to break down these massive document releases into 5 key areas: the philosophy of immunity, the architecture of influence, shattering the silence, the reckoning begins, and finally, the blueprint for reform. All right, starting right off with section 1, the philosophy of immunity. The absolute bedrock of this whole system, it's something called reputational laundering. So Epstein funneled millions into places like Harvard and MIT. And look, it wasn't for charity. He was basically buying a shield of academic legitimacy. The sources detail how Harvard accepted over $9 million, actually granting him a visiting fellow title, even though he had 0 academic credentials. And honestly, even after his 2008 state conviction, institutions like MIT's Media Lab just kept right on taking his money. He essentially bought himself a halo effect. By surrounding himself with Nobel laureates and these prestigious thinkers, he completely blinded society and law enforcement to his underlying criminal behavior. And that naturally leads us to institutional betrayal. You've got to wonder, why did so many really powerful people just stay quiet? Well, in elite circles, access is everything. It's the currency. People literally prioritized rubbing shoulders with wealth and power over doing the right thing. They chose silence to protect their access to that elite network. The sources describe this as a form of pluralistic ignorance. Basically, people assumed that, hey, because institutions like Harvard were hosting him, the situation must somehow be under control. They focused on his giant charitable checks, letting themselves mentally separate the philanthropist from the predator. And that collective silence, that was the absolute bedrock of his immunity.
Moving on to section 2, the architecture of influence.
Okay, the stark reality here is what legal scholars are now calling the Florida blueprint. Just look at the insane contrast between the original mid-2000s Florida probe and that manufactured leniency of the secret 2008 deal, which was negotiated by then U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta. A 56-page draft indictment from 2007 shows that federal prosecutors originally wanted to charge Epstein with over 30 counts of sex trafficking. Over 30! Yet what actually materialized in 2008 was a secret non-prosecution agreement, or NPA. This deal, completely hidden from the victims, granted sweeping immunity not just to Epstein, but to unnamed co-conspirators. It's cited today as the ultimate case study in how a totally private justice system exists for those who can afford high-ranking legal fixers.
Which brings us to section 3, shattering the silence.
We absolutely have to highlight the real catalyst here. Julie K. Brown's groundbreaking 2018 journalism, which, by the way, later earned a 2026 Pulitzer Special Citation. She exposed exactly how prosecutors shielded Epstein from federal charges. Her Perversion of Justice series in the Miami Herald meticulously tore apart the secrecy of that 2008 non-prosecution agreement. But more importantly, she recentered the entire narrative on the survivors, women who had been completely ignored by the justice system for over a decade. Her journalism literally ignited a global reckoning and practically forced law enforcement to reopen the books.
And man, state-level actions followed fast. Back in 2019, the New Mexico State Land Office started heavily reviewing and working to outright terminate agricultural leases on Epstein's massive Zorro ranch. They handed over hundreds of pages of state trust land lease documents straight to the Attorney General. This proved that the push for accountability wasn't just isolated to federal courts in New York or Florida. It was stretching all the way out to state lands in the American West. Just listen to this quote from 2019. It perfectly captures the massive institutional pushback that was finally taking hold. Commissioner Stephanie Garcia Richard made it crystal clear that the state land office was hunting down every possible legal avenue to kill those legally binding contracts. It shows this massive immediate shift in institutional tolerance. Suddenly, doing business with a known predator, even indirectly through some Virgin Islands shell company, became a massive, totally unacceptable liability.
All right, Section 4, the reckoning begins. Let's map out this monumental shift from that 2019 federal arrest all the way up to 2026. After the 2019 indictment and, his subsequent death in custody, a massive multi-year legal battle over the documents kicked off. Starting in January 2024, judges finally began unsealing court records. Then, in a totally landmark move, Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act in late 2025. By January 2026, this legislation legally forced the DOJ to declassify and release 3.5 million pages of records, along with hundreds of thousands of images and videos. It took this entire saga from a closed, secretive legal proceeding into total, unblinking public transparency. And that leads us to our final section, Section 5, the blueprint for reform. So the crucial takeaway from this legislation is actually pretty straightforward. The Epstein Files Transparency Act legally forced the Department of Justice to dump all unclassified files and over 180,000 images right into a public digital archive. The sources really emphasize a massive philosophical shift here, proving that secrecy is a predator's absolute greatest ally. Sunlight, brought on by legal unsealing, acts as this giant societal audit. It ensures the government can never again hide systemic abuse cases behind closed doors just to protect the privacy of high-profile VIPs. Riding right on the heels of that momentum, we have the Fairness for Survivors Act. This was a total game changer. It completely removed the statute of limitations for civil suits in organized human trafficking. That permanently shifts the power right back to the survivors. It basically ensures that perpetrators and their enablers can't just wait out the clock to dodge civil liability. It finally acknowledges that the trauma and the complex cover-ups often last for decades, so the legal window for justice absolutely has to reflect that reality. And this brings us to the new Epstein rule in academia. Remember when we talked about MIT a minute ago? Well, internal emails showed administrators were actually referring to Epstein as Voldemort to hide his identity so they could keep taking his money. Seriously. So the new disclosure law steps in and requires universities to publicly report any donations from individuals convicted of crimes against minors, regardless of how small the check is. It ensures universities can never, ever again silently accept dark money and provide a reputational shield to a convicted offender. Pulling this all together, the analysis outlines these 3 pillars of never again. Number 1, the end of reputational shielding. This requires mandatory ethics vetting for philanthropy, so rich donors can't just buy a halo. Number 2, justice without a price tag. This means outright banning those secret, sweetheart non-prosecution deals that totally bypass victims' rights. And number 3, dismantling the enabler class. This is all about holding the entire ecosystem accountable. Pilots, bankers, lawyers, they can no longer hide behind the excuse of just doing my job when they're facilitating trafficking. Silence is now officially recognized as a form of participation. Wrapping up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really powerful mandate from the 2026 analysis. Justice is not a guest list. Power is not a permit for predation. Unsealing these millions of pages wasn't just about punishing the past, it was about hardening our society against the future. So the real question we have to ask ourselves moving forward is this: how are we going to continue forcing transparency to make sure our legal, financial, and academic systems actually protect the vulnerable rather than the influential? Think about that for a second, and keep demanding accountability.
Like this video, share with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to History Doc.